Raiden rerun FAQ. Thanks for everyone who sent in questions, and let's get into it. So the first question, at C0, does she really keep up with other DPS characters like Hu Tao or Ayaka? And then a similar question, is Raiden still a good DPS at low or medium investment? So the truth is, at C0, outside of something like Raiden National, then not really, though I don't think Hu Tao and Ayaka are good examples either. But also at C0, you don't really need her to be a pure DPS anyway, since Raiden works well in national teams and hyperbloom. Now, having said that, I do have to give a shout out to creators like LWK, who has got amazing C0 Raiden hyper gameplay in old abysses. But yeah, the thing with this is that you really need short abysses to get it to work great like this. This is because Raiden's damage is very concentrated in a 7-second window. So if the content is short enough, like a PMA fight where you can take advantage of that, then she can work great. But if you can't get the job done in this short damage window, then there's so much downtime and her clear times will really fall behind. This is why in C0 Raiden speedrunning, you only really see Raiden National, and only when it's content that suits Raiden National, like abysses with a lot of bossing, like last patch's abyss. You can see in my own gameplay, I'm able to one rotate many bosses, and this is because the team's damage window is very long, and the damage window starts way before you even switch to Raiden. Xiangling's doing damage, and Xingqiu is able to vaporize his skills for lots of damage, and then Raiden continues your damage window whilst recharging the team's energy, and you can get pretty impressive results with this team. But that's not to say that Raiden is weak in this team. She's just doing her job, which is adding to the team's damage whilst also restoring the team's energy. And yes, technically this is more of a combined team damage team rather than a Raiden carry team, but that is still the strength of her kit, especially if you're only looking at Raiden at C0. And like I said earlier, I don't think Hu Tao is a good example of a C0 character who keeps up either, and this is coming from someone who plays a lot with Hu Tao. I think casually it's just not fun playing her at C0, doing jump cancels. The average player hates that. And then even for hardcore speedruns, everyone uses C1 minimum, even if they still use 4-star weapons. I wouldn't really talk negatively about C0 Raiden and positively about C0 Hu Tao when there's newer characters like Neuvillette or Linny or Navia who have a lot more complete kits at C0. So the next topic is a pretty interesting topic. There's a lot of questions about how Furina Taser compares to Raiden's other teams. People wanting to see comparisons with Raiden's OG teams versus Raiden Furina teams, and between Double Hydro and Hyper, which is the best in terms of speedrun. So they are basically referring to a team like this, and there have been spreadsheet calculations going around since Furina's release that Raiden's new highest DPS teams are Double Hydro teams, and honestly you will see it all over Reddit and YouTube that this is her strongest team now. But the question is, does that theory actually translate into practice? And I can give you a hardcore player's perspective. First of all, the positives about this team is that it's really chill to play. I actually use this team quite a bit for artifact farming. Raiden's optimal combo in this team is just normal attack spamming, so it does make it very easy to play Raiden and you don't have to think about any combos. And it's still pretty good in the Abyss. I've used it before to get my 36-star Prima Gems. But moving on to the negatives, which are, honestly, this is kind of a theoretical spreadsheet team, and calculations that can show it with super high DPS and Raiden's highest DPS team. Unfortunately, that doesn't really factor in so many things. Firstly, calcs don't factor in damage profiles like front loaded damage or nuke damage. In this case, the power you can get from Sara and Raiden nuking enemies quickly, or in a national team, the vaporized skills you get with Xingqiu and Xiangling's personal damage before Raiden even takes the field. This has a lot of in-game value, and meanwhile, this double Hydro team is basically entirely sustained damage. So let me show you the differences in game. So as you may or may not know, when people try to clear the PMA boss as fast as possible, you basically have until around 9:47 on the timer to clear the first HP threshold, which is about 2/3 of its HP. And if you do that, the boss will stop taking damage and it will start transitioning into its second phase, which is the minion phase, instead of wasting more time. So you don't even need to be a whale to do this. You just need a team that can hit hard but also set up quickly. So here's me doing it with Raiden Hyper. I do have C2 and the catch on Raiden, don't get me wrong. I'm not even using Cosmo's burst here. And you can see the strength of this team is that you can adjust the team setup to be very fast, and Raiden's nuke damage is enough to meet the damage threshold. You can then do another flexible setup to clear the minions and the boss, and you can see the flexibility and the power of this team right here. So you might say, of course Raiden Hyper is strong because you have Raiden C2, but there's also this gameplay here of me not even critting with Raiden's burst, yet I'm still able to meet the 9:47 damage threshold too. So I'm sure even at C0, if you do manage to crit your attacks, you can probably get similar results to this. Moving on to Raiden National, this is also a team that has front loaded damage and a flexible setup. Now normally with Raiden National setups you start with Xingqiu's burst, but here I'd rather use Xiangling's burst as fast as possible so it comes back quicker for phase 2, and I don't even need Sacrificial Sword on Xingqiu here for 2 vaporized skills. It's better for me just to use one so I can get to Raiden's burst quicker, and you can see this team is pretty comfortable to hit the 9:47 threshold too. And again, you might say that I have Raiden C2, so of course this team is strong, but as I've mentioned in my previous videos, upgrading Xiangling's weapon from something like Dragon's Bane to Scarlet Sands is actually stronger than getting Raiden C2 in this team. So you can definitely get similar or even stronger results at C0. So you can see Raiden National, again another team, even with 4-star weapons, it's a team that has very flexible front loaded damage, and you can be very tactical with the team to get the best results. Now this time let me show you double Hydro, which is supposed to be higher damage theoretically than both of the previous teams, and I'll even use Aqua Simulacra on Yelan. And bear in mind this team already has 3 5-star teammates. So the problem that you'll notice with this team is that there's no way to really speed up your damage and get it front loaded enough to hit the 9:47 HP threshold. Yelan's skill is the only thing I can really skip here, and even with skipping Yelan's skill you can see the DPS is just not enough at all. You can see that their team's damage isn't really enough to hit the 9:47 threshold. And you can see I lost a lot of time on that first phase, and even on the second phase I'm losing even more time because I can't nuke this first enemy quick enough. And this clear is definitely not perfect. I could probably optimize this and get it a bit faster, but it's still going to be way behind the other 2 teams, even with all these 5-star characters. So you can see the problem, which is that this team just doesn't do much damage during its setup, and Raiden definitely does not have enough buffs in this team. Her burst doing 164k there is pretty bad, and the calcs that say this is all high DPS, it's assuming all that sub DPS damage is going to be hitting over 20 seconds. If I was fighting an enemy with infinite HP, then all that damage will add up for sure, but in practice the damage that you can do quickly can be more important, which is what you get with her other teams, and we're not fighting infinite HP enemies to take advantage of the sustained damage of double Hydro. But you might say that this is just one issue with HP thresholded bosses, And you're right, but we can get into more issues. So another one is anytime you see damage calculations similar to this, where the damage is evenly spread between 3 or 4 characters like this, especially in comparison to a more hypercarry focused team where one character is doing the majority of the damage. This means that the evenly spread team generally scales much worse with investment. So whenever you get a stronger artifact on your Raiden, you get a cool piece like this. Because the rest of your team doesn't benefit from the artifact, you actually get less value from that. And this also applies to weapon upgrades. Getting a weapon that does 10% more damage in a hypercarry team, you're getting much more bang for your buck than if you got 10% more damage on Raiden in a team like this. And this is something that most calculations won't really show, which is showing different levels of investment and different builds and how it can affect the relative differences between each team. And then another point is that by reducing Raiden's damage in a team like this, and Raiden is a character with a very good AoE burst and AoE charge attacks, it makes a team like this very single target focused. Of course, a team like Raiden National is also single target focused, but it doesn't rely on debuffs like a double Hydro team does, where the team gets a lot of damage from the VV debuffs here. So say for example in the current Chamber 2, when new enemies spawn, your Raiden National team's damage will stay pretty consistent, whereas with double Hydro teams, a new enemy will not be debuffed, so your team's damage will go down if Raiden's still on the field. And then a last issue is that it's actually pretty difficult to consistently swirl both Electro and Hydro in this team in order to get those VV debuffs. This is because the only off-field Electro application is coming from Raiden's elemental skill, and during your setup that will be getting flooded by Furina's attacks and Yelan's attacks. And if you do fail to reduce enemies' Electro resistance, then that low Raiden's damage will become even lower. I think overall the reality is that honestly this team just sucks for hardcore optimization unless you have a lot of constellations to make up for the lack of upfront damage. Maybe you have C2 Furina, C2 Yelan, and you can see the strength of Raiden Hyper and Raiden National in the single target DPS Cup recently. But then the problem is, outside of speedruns, if we stop looking at speedruns, does this team really have more quality of life and utility than the other teams? It's hard to say this team is better in those perspectives either, because Raiden National has Bennett's fast healing, it has Xingqiu's damage reduction, and you might already have these 4-star teammates, and it uses only 4-star characters who you might already have. And Raiden Hyper team has Kazuha's grouping and Raiden's AoE damage. And even the new Overload teams with chevreuse have very long lasting buffs and debuffs, so they have quality of life too. Now, having said all this, I do understand that some people will be annoyed. I'm sure a lot of you don't want to still be playing old teams and still be playing Bennett. You want to move on to new characters and you want your DPSs to be getting buffed a lot and getting upgraded teams. And I do get that, but these classic teams with Bennett Kazuha, Bennett Xiangling, honestly, it's just really hard to beat them, and we see it time and time again. And even if these teams are beaten in theoretical calculations, it's often the case that practically they can still win out. And actually in Chinese communities like NGA or Bilibili, this is actually a common discussion. They call teams like Double Hydro Raiden CJB teams. Now don't look up the meaning of that, but it's basically CN internet slang similar to batchest in English. So if you know what that emoji is, it's similar, and it's basically teams that get talked up a lot but they don't actually deliver. And this is kind of a sensitive topic. It's an issue that has happened with many Furina teams, at least for hardcore players, and there are divides with casual opinions and hardcore opinions, where because of Furina's team-wide buffs, her sub DPS damage, her teams are always going to look very impressive theoretically, and they often look like upgrades for a ton of DPSs. For example, characters like Raiden, maybe Hu Tao, maybe Keqing, maybe Ayaka. There's quite a few characters where it's very contentious whether Furina is actually an upgrade for them, because the new teams look great on paper, but it doesn't always translate. And I've covered this in previous videos. If you do browse hardcore communities, you can see a sentiment that at least at C0, Furina actually isn't a best in stock teammate for many of these characters. And I can definitely agree with that, again, at least from a hardcore player's perspective. So Raiden actually did get more new teams this patch, and there are quite a few questions asking me to compare the new chevreuse teams with Raiden's old teams, especially teams like Raiden, chevreuse, Sara, Xiangling, and with Bennett as well. People wanting to know how chevreuse is and can she replace Bennett or Kazuha in Raiden teams. So I have been doing some testing, and I also made a community post a few days ago, which some of you might have seen, which is how players both on Bilibili and also players from my Discord have been optimizing chevreuse and Raiden. And basically there's two ways people have been cooking. You can either play them with Bennett or you can play them without Bennett. So chevreuse's main strength in any team is that her buffs and debuffs don't require her to constantly switch back in on field. You know, she's not like Kazuha who needs to switch back into Swirl, and this makes the current abyss perfect for her. For example, if you were using Kazuha or Jean in Chamber 2, each of these spawning enemies won't be debuffed. You will need to switch those anime characters back in order to debuff them, which isn't possible unless you switch out of Raiden. Whereas chevreuse's support is constant, so you can stay on Raiden for consistent damage, and this can make the team perform surprisingly well in AoE, despite people might usually associate overload teams being bad in AoE. And then for the Tulpa boss in Chamber 3, this also showcases another one of her strengths, which is chevreuse's ability to debuff is not nerfed by Tulpa, who has a permanent Hydra aura on itself, whereas Kazuha cannot swirl properly to apply his damage increases well. And if you're playing someone like Xingqiu, obviously he doesn't do any damage here. And from our testing, you can perform well with Bennett and without Bennett. So with this C0 Raiden, I was able to one rotate with Bennett chevreuse, whereas I couldn't one rotate with chevreuse Sara. But I will say that this Sara wasn't fully invested in, so if she was maxed out, I think it would be pretty close actually. Meaning there's a good chance that the Sara chevreuse team is a side grade to the Bennett chevreuse team in single target, whilst also being better in AoE. So that's something I'm hoping to test with a more even playing field. And also both of these variations, they do seem to be similar to Raiden National, but because of this abyss being very unfavorable to Hydros, I'm not confident enough to say which one is actually stronger. But they all do seem to be pretty close, which is very exciting. But overall, my initial opinion is very positive about chevreuse Raiden synergy. So I'll probably do an update in the future once I have a better understanding of it. Next questions: what are important animation cancels in Raiden's teams? People are also asking which is better, N3C or charge attack spam. I've mentioned in previous videos how speedrunners use charge attack spam a lot. People are asking about Raiden's highest DPS strings. I've seen some Raiden speedrun do charge attacks very quickly, but you failed to imitate it. So Raiden's playstyle is very simple. Basically, if your Raiden is doing most of the team's damage, then you want to be spamming her charge attacks. Something like N1CD, which means one normal attack and then one charge attack. And like I said, ideally you should dash cancel it, so N1CD. You should try practice this. Dash cancelling is a very small difference, but you might find it easier to find the right timing. And you don't want to dash too early or Raiden might end up missing some of her hits. Also, don't click too early, or you can do something like that where Raiden basically stops doing anything. So N1CD is Raiden's max DPS combo, so it's worth it, it's worth learning. And her charge attacks also have very huge AoE, so this combo also has the most AoE, which you'd want to take advantage of too. But if you're playing Raiden in a team where she is more of a driver, like a national team or a double hydro team, then you can do either normal attack spam or just something like N3C. It isn't really much of a difference. Something like N4D works really well. So the reason why you do some of these longer combos is you can get more of Yelan or Xingqiu's burst hits, and Raiden can also reapply Electro onto enemies faster, so it can help Xiangling get more overloads. And these teams are also generally easy to play, so just spamming normal attacks on Raiden, just left clicking, it's easy, and her normal attacks also have good tracking towards enemies, so that makes things even easier too. And then this question is also asking, is there some trick to making Sara feel more smooth to play? I think the trick is just understanding how versatile Sara is. As long as you have her C2, which leaves another crow feather at her original location, this means Sara has basically 3 things, which is her skill, her charge attack, and her burst. Each of these 3 things can buff a teammate, and you don't always need all of them too. For example, if you just want to buff Raiden, you can just use Sara's burst and then just swap her off. Alternatively, using Sara's skill and then her charge attack is good if you need the energy particles, and that can also buff more teammates, like buffing Sara herself or buffing Kazuha or Xiangling. You just have to think about what you need for a particular fight, how much characters you want to get buffed, do you need energy, and I think that definitely helps make her feel smoother to play, because I know a lot of people find her clunky to play, but they don't take full advantage of Sara's flexibility. Next question, does Raiden Hyper have similar problems to Eula by overkilling enemies in multi-wave content, especially with something like her C2? Honestly, I would say yes. I think the biggest problem Raiden Hyper has is that it deals a lot of damage in a very short DPS window. Raiden has one of the shortest DPS windows, but outside of that period, the whole team doesn't really do that much damage. Raiden's nuke can also kill enemies before you even get to basic attack with her, meaning you might not have been able to refill your team's energy for the next chamber, so that can defeat the purpose of Raiden being a battery. So if you don't plan a strategy around this, you can have many awkward moments with Raiden Hyper, especially towards the end of a chamber. You might not want to waste your burst, but the team also doesn't do much damage without burst. Whilst Raiden Hyper can still be one of the strongest teams in the game, and we still see her performing well in speedruns, it's definitely not one of the more versatile teams in the game, and it has a lot of flaws practically. So its strength does vary depending on the abyss. You might see Hyper perform well one abyss, but then she just disappears the next, and honestly it's very inconsistent in that regard. Next question, how much does Raiden contribute to the teams where she acts more as a driver enabler rather than a main DPS like a national team or double hydro, and how does it compare to other national or double hydro teams? So for the national team, being honest, I wouldn't even say Raiden is the strongest option or even an upgrade. Other options, for example, being Kazuha or being Sucrose. I would say Raiden's main advantage here is being the easiest to play out of them, and I think the average player would get way closer to playing Raiden National at a high level compared to the average player playing Kazuha or Sucrose at a high level. That being said, as we discussed in this video, the Raiden team does have some optimizations, like equipping the right gear. You want Instructor on Bennett and you want Noblesse on Xingqiu. You want your Xiangling to have a very good build. You also might want to know how to vaporize Xingqiu's skill. But yeah, the animo characters, like I said, Kazuha or Sucrose, in the hands of a very skilled player, they are pretty similar to Raiden in single target, potentially even stronger than Raiden, whilst having grouping for AoE, especially Kazuha. But with these characters, there's a much bigger skill gap, so Raiden is definitely the easiest one to play. And to be honest, Hoyo have even used Raiden National in adverts for the game. You could say it's one of the flagship noob friendly teams to play, so that's definitely a huge benefit for her, that this is a nice team for most players in the game who are not experts. And then as for double hydro teams, as we've covered it in the video, I don't think these teams are amazing. Raiden is one of the better options in this team, don't get me wrong. She is a very easy way to basically drive this double hydro core, but there are better teams for both this core and for Raiden herself. Like if I did want an easy double hydro core team to play, I could play Kokomi, who will have Kazuha's grouping and Kokomi's healing, and as you've seen in my previous video, I actually can have enough DPS to one rotate enemies with this team too, whereas I struggle to do it with Raiden. Next question, if you were to wail on her banner, which one would you go for first, constellation or weapon refinement? So comparing these two banners, I would go for constellations. Her weapon is good for sure, but this is a very good time to get C6 chevreuse, even C6 Sara and C6 Bennett if you don't have them already. This is basically very close to a perfect banner for Raiden, so that gives extra incentive to wish on this, whereas this weapon banner isn't really anything special. And then a similar question to that, is it worth putting on the banner to try snipe Chevy if my Raiden is C2? Well, worth is always dependent on your own situation and how much primos you have. But I can say for context, I already have C2 Raiden. On my personal account, I didn't want to risk pulling for chevreuse, so take from that what you will. So how well does Raiden function as an aggravate character? What would the team recommendation be? And similarly, how much value does she have in quicken teams? Is she a good option? I think Raiden's aggravate teams are fine for casual play if you want to experiment and have fun with them, but it's not really a playstyle you're going to see much speed running with. For the most part, aggravate teams are if you want to play Raiden and Miko in the same team, or if you have Baiju and you don't want to play Bennett. So a team example I would suggest is Raiden, Baiju, Kazuha, Yaya, Miko. And honestly, this team does have sound logic, and it really is a fairly popular team for casual play. It's just like I said, the way I play the game very hardcore, it's not a hardcore team. Speaking of Raiden aggravate, another question, is the optimal combo for Raiden aggravate different from hypercarry, since she benefits from more rapid attacks as opposed to a few higher scaling attacks? Would N4C be better? Now I know actually for most of the CN gameplay I've seen, you still do N1C with aggravate, although as you said, since her rapid attacks do gain value, it's not going to be as big of a difference compared to a hypercarry team. Next question, how does she hold up to the current premier 5-star teams like Neuvillette, Al Haytham Hyperbloom, Navia, Nilu, Linny with Furina? It seems that she's fallen off besides as a Hyperbloom trigger. Even the new Furina Yelanjin teams feels underwhelming. Yeah, you're right about that. But to answer your question, to be honest, it depends on how you play the game, as I always say. Like how I play the game, which is trying to figure out the best strats and optimize teams. But I wouldn't even say that these examples are great examples. Like Al Haytham Hyperbloom, I know he is seen as a god for casual play, but honestly, if you're into speedrunning, then you'll know it's really difficult to get nice speedruns out of him. He doesn't really have much front-loaded damage, and actually there was a challenge on my Discord of trying to figure out if Al Haytham could hit the 947 HP threshold on PMA without having a lot of constellations, and eventually someone in CN did manage to do it with C0 characters, but they did say it was very painful and it took maybe 50 retries to get this happen even once or twice. And then you also said Linny with Furina, but honestly Linny with Furina isn't really better than his mono pyro team. I think it's more like a side grade depending on how much constellations you have. And then as a Nilu player myself, there's plenty of abysses where she's not really anything special. To be honest, I don't really like comparing different teams like this, especially these days. Abysses change a lot. One cycle a team gets countered, next cycle they are advantaged. I think it's safe to say Neuvillette is at the top in terms of a complete package DPS, but then everyone else is just so subjective depending on how you play the game, whether you're a casual player or hardcore player. And then as I said, it can even depend on the current abyss and who benefits from it. So it's all very subjective and vague. There's no real meaning to what is the current premier teams, premier DPSs. Honestly, I'm not really the biggest believer in that. What do you think about Hyperbloom Raiden versus her other teams in both low and high investment? Honestly, I think Hyperbloom Raiden teams are pretty good if you either are willing to play without a healer or a teammate already has healing or a shield. As I've covered in my previous videos, that trade-off usually isn't worth it compared to just playing Kuki Shinobu, who already has healing. A newer player clearing their first abyss, they're unlikely to be playing with a healerless team, it probably is a bit more realistic to be playing Shinobu instead of Raiden. And I could definitely see a team like this being very casual player friendly. So yeah, that's one of the main issues with Raiden hyperbloom, is that abysses these days have a lot more dangerous enemies than before. So her not being able to heal and her damage isn't really much better than Shinobu. That is a big weakness for Raiden. I do think it's worth mentioning that a lot of hyperbloom team strength is assuming you're playing Nahida, and she doesn't rerun too often. So there's a good chance a newer player doesn't have Nahida either. So your overall Raiden and hyperbloom teams is pretty good, but it really does depend on what your account state is, which characters you have, which gear you have to make which teams. Obviously, if the question is about speedrunning, then that is a different story. I'm sure you knew that already, but even if you are playing the strongest variations, maybe you have C2 Nahida, maybe you have Al Haytham, they are used sometimes though. It really just depends on the specific abyss and if it's beneficial towards hyperbloom. So that's it for the FAQ. A lot of people did have similar-ish questions, so hopefully I covered what you were looking for. If I missed anyone, then feel free to ask again in the comments and I will try to answer there. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did pull Raiden this banner, then I hope your pulls went well. I hope you enjoy her, and thanks for watching.